Welcome to the Working Genius podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Pat Lencioni, your host, joined by the full crew. We've got Bo, Cody, and Tracy today. How you guys doing?
Wonderful.
Superb.
Awesome.
Great. We've got Matt, our engineer, and Karen in studio helping me out here, keeping me on track. Cody, what's the topic today?
Introverts, extroverts, and working genius.
That's right. Introverts, extroverts, and working genius. You know, one of the things people like to ask, in fact, just the other day I was giving a talk and somebody asked me is, how does working genius differ from things like the Myers-Briggs or StrengthsFinder or DISC or anything else? And we love all those tools. We've always been kind of junkies for those. But working genius is different because it focuses on the energy and joy you get from doing certain kinds of tasks. And it's much more immediately applicable to your job and to how your team works and all of those different things. Having said that, there's one element of Myers-Briggs that really is relevant to and worth talking about as it relates to working genius, and that's whether or not you're an introvert or an extrovert, which is essentially where you get your energy, whether it's from being with other people or by being by yourself. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We love the connection between these two things. I will say before we get started that there is not a correlation. We thought there might be, but in Myers-Briggs, no matter what your Myers-Briggs type is, it doesn't mean that's an indication of what your working genius is, because we've seen it all. Cody and I are both ENFPs. We have different working geniuses. I recently met a co-ENFP who was an ET in working genius, which is the polar opposite of me. And I didn't know such a person existed. But as it turns out, Myers-Briggs, working genius, completely different. But today we're going to talk about introvert and extrovert.
And maybe one way to describe the way that they're different is their layers. They're layers of being able to understand ourselves and other people. And part of the conversation today that should be fun is how different geniuses might show up being more extroverted or introverted.
Absolutely. And, you know, for those of you who know working genius well, you know that the W, D, and E across the top, wonder, discernment, and enablement, those are all what we call responsive geniuses, responding to the environment. Whereas I, G, and T across the bottom, invention, galvanizing, and tenacity are all what we call disruptive. Well, as it turns out, one might assume that introverts would be more likely to be responsive and extroverts disruptive. And it's just not true. And that's why some people can have a hard time believing another person's genius, because they're misunderstanding that whether they're introverted and extroverted does not indicate what their genius is.
And I think it's been fun, Pat, because we so often use Myers-Briggs for many years, and then discovering working genius, that we're sort of steeped in that, you know, observing people that way and how they show up based on their Myers-Briggs profile. And what we've learned over the last 3 years is we keep encountering people with working genius combinations, and we're saying, boy, you're showing up a little differently than this other person we know who has the same genius as you. And this can help. It helps you, one, sort of solicit that in a different way from another member of your team. It's immensely practical. It's not just like brain candy, like, oh, you're an introverted wanderer. It's really about how do we tap into those geniuses with the layer of knowing, are you an extrovert or introvert on top of that?
That's right. You know what I think might be helpful is to help people understand that don't know the Myers-Briggs, what an introvert and extrovert is, what the difference is. Because it's not what we think of oftentimes. An extrovert is simply somebody who gets their energy from being around other people, which means thinking out loud, responding immediately, brainstorming, you know, and living out loud like that is very natural to them. You ask them what they think, whether they know it or not, they're very comfortable sharing it. They're almost putting their cognitive process out loud outside their brain. An introvert, on the other hand, can be a very gregarious, kind, funny person, obviously, but they like to process internally. They get their energy about going inside themselves. They need to go regroup. So you ask an introvert, what do you think? And they might think, let me give me some time to process this. Also, an introvert at the end of a day, even doing things they love, might be a little bit more tired because they've expended a lot of energy. Whereas if you take me, and Tracy knows this well as my editor, when I go write by myself, I am exhausted because I need to be around other people to kind of fill me up again. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we mean by introvert. It's not about being outgoing or capable or funny or having a great personality. It's about where you get your energy and how you process things.
when you start to look at that, I think the reason that we're talking about this today is at least a couple times in the last week. I was on a phone call with Tracy earlier today where we experienced how an introvert or extroverted person is showing up differently, even though they have the same Myers-Briggs. So Tracy, I actually had you try to guess someone's working genius type after you've met them for about 5 minutes, because I kind of anticipated you being wrong based on this very principle. And you were wrong. Yeah.
It was so interesting. So we were chatting with this guy today, interviewing him, and the way he was showing up, he was very quiet and a little bit more reserved. He seemed really asking great questions, and Cody paused and said, "Well, what do you think he is?" And I thought, "Oh, for sure he's a D, just maybe a W based on some of the questions he was asking." He seemed really thoughtful. So I guessed him a DG. And Cody was like, "Nope, he's an IG." And let me tell you, he looked so different. Most IGs that I've met, Bo, you're an IG. You looked nothing like this guy. It was wild. But as we continued to talk, it was clear to me, oh yeah, he's clearly an IG.
Now, the more you work with a person like that, then you get to see more of that because they start to put it out there. So this is not like they're going to look different forever. What it means, though, is they're not going to put it out there so quickly, and they're going to be a little bit more reluctant to assert in the same way. But it doesn't change the fact that is their working genius. The things they love to do are the same. So Bo and that guy would both get energy and joy out of doing the same kind of activities, but that might not look the same to an outsider at first glance.
Yep. And I want to make this super practical because, I work with Bo every day. He's an extrovert and he's an inventor. And so the way that shows up for him is you don't have to ask him what he's inventing. He's going to process that out loud. He'll go to the whiteboard and say, "I have an idea," or "I have 5 ideas," whereas this other person that we met, because they're more introverted, they're processing internally. They might have a whole diary of ideas, but they're not as adept at as immediately extroverting them and processing out loud. So they probably are still, they both enjoy the activity of invention, but the way we observe it and the way we tap into it as a team member of theirs can be very different.
Yeah, it's so good. We were having this conversation before, Pat. We were saying, introversion, extroverted. It's that desire to be around people, getting your energy, but that's so limited if that's the only thing, the only way we have to understand people. And then Pat, you said this great line. It's like, yes, being around people doing what? Because an extroverted wanderer we have an extroverted wanderer in our office. They want to be around people doing very different sorts of work than an extroverted person with tenacity. And both can be true. We've seen that people who are extroverted with tenacity. I can't even imagine this, loving to be around people and getting things done. They love just getting things across the finish line, but it's energizing to be in a room with other people. Cody, how many times have we stepped into a room like that and there's extroverts at their computer finishing together? That's just very, very different types of work, even though they love being around people.
And their genius is far more important because if you were to ask me as an extrovert, would I like to do accounting in a room full of people I really liked, or would I rather be alone and write a book? Even though that it would be painful for me to pick the alone thing, so much of my joy and energy comes from what I'm doing. And the only benefit to being with a bunch of people doing accounting is I'd have somebody to complain about how much I sucked at it and how I couldn't wait for it to be done. But that's not an overriding factor in choosing what you do.
And Pat, this has shown up in our even team context many times. We didn't have language for it before Working Genius, but you and I, we used to think, we're both extroverted people, and so we love to brainstorm out loud. But now that we know that we both share a genius called discernment, and Tracy and Karen also have discernment, we'll get in a brainstorming session, and you and I are discerning out loud. We're extroverting all of our thoughts. Things are changing in the moment, and Tracy and Karen are processing internally. And oftentimes we have to look at them and say, "Hey, are you guys tracking here? Are you engaged with this?" And they're like, "We're totally engaged." But we as extroverts hasn't even given them an opportunity to weigh in on that.
Yes, Pat, we just had this experience this afternoon. An hour ago. We were in a brainstorming session, and poor Pat was in the room with 4 introverts. Oh my goodness. And he was looking around going, okay, guys, give me something because we're
Right.
all in our heads processing.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd come up with an idea and I wouldn't get anything from them. And I realized, I said to them, if I were with you one-on-one, you probably would be giving me more, even though you're an introvert, because they all have discernment and I trust their gut. But then you put 3 or 4 of them in a room together and they're all like, well, you don't need my opinion. You don't need my affirmation. Everybody else will do it. And it was just like, and it's so funny because every time we do a podcast, right before we start, we go, we should name this. And inevitably I start throwing out naming ideas. And it feels like I'm at the guillotine ready to be killed because nobody's saying anything. Oh, no, they hate this. And they're like, no, we like it. We're with you. Oh, a nod and a yes would be okay there.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
No. It's just you're introverting your discernment, and I love your discernment, and I trust it, and so I have to understand. Oh, yeah, I probably need to ask her because she's
That's
not
right.
naturally going to extrovert it as much. That's okay. It's a great way for me to understand it.
So we've talked a little bit about invention. We've talked a little bit about discernment. The one that I think people who understand working genius might be curious about is galvanizing. What we can imagine what it looks like to be a galvanizer as an extrovert, and obviously that's near perfection. But if you were galvanizing and you were more introverted, what does that look like to be a galvanizer and be more introverted?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Cody and Tracy, who are in the room with one today. So tell us about that.
This my first thought was this, is that I love being around other people, and I love galvanizing and rallying the troops and pushing and getting momentum on something. And as an extrovert, the flaw that I might have in that is that I think it's like volume of words and encouragement. If I can just get in there and say as many words as I can and if I'm not getting nods or reaction, I'm going to keep going. And this gentleman that we were talking to today was so precise and clear, and it didn't take as many words, but he was still you could tell the galvanizing was coming out in a little bit more precise and refined way.
Yeah, what I was thinking is probably the method of how you galvanize might be different. Because you can galvanize with email. I'm going to send them an email every day, and I'm going to remind them, and I'm going to keep them on task. And that's not Cody's thing. Cody's like, I'm right in front of them. I'm going to get excited. I'm going to tell a joke. I'm going to be excited visually. And so it might be just how you go about galvanizing might be different.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And it's also a good reminder of working genius is the phase of work that you love, that you get joy and energy from, right? So what that individual loves to do, knowing that about him, although on the outside he might not seem as gregarious as Cody, I know that he will love the work of helping to focus and energize and keep us on track with what's most important.
Gosh, I just realized I'm an ID. I'm an inventor discerner. But since I'm an extrovert, I prefer to do it, as everybody knows, sometimes to their what's the right word? To their chagrin. And that is, I love to get people in a room and invent and discern together. And so a really introverted ID would probably go, please leave me alone for a few weeks while I go come up with the next 12 ideas.
Yep.
And so it's just how it shows up and how we interact with others. It's just a fascinating conversation because I think adding this allows us to understand one another even more and to avoid misjudging them or to feel guilty about the way we go about things.
And I've said before, we talked a little bit about, Matt is an introverted wanderer. We did wonder last episode, and we have someone in the office who's an extroverted wanderer, where very often you don't have to ask the extroverted wanderer, what are you thinking? You don't have to say hey, what are the questions that you have or what you're considering? Whereas Matt, if you pause and get a chance to ask an introvert to say, hey, tell me what's going on in your intuition, your gut, what questions do you have? They're often just as profound, but you have to give them space and time for him to extrovert those things.
In fact, I would say they're usually more profound because as a percentage, if you hear 3 things from an introverted person, all 3 have been vetted and thought about.
Yeah.
And so they might have 2 more, but if you hear 7 things from me, you got to, figure out which of them add value. And there's probably 2, and the other 5, you got to just go, he was just talking out loud, thinking out loud.
Yeah.
Very good. The last thing I want to say is that extroverted people often seem like they're disruptive. So we tend to say that. And there are extroverted wanderers, and there are extroverted discerners. And so it doesn't mean they're disruptive. They're just speaking. And so it's really important that we don't decide, because otherwise we'll confuse ourselves. Like, I don't understand why that person looks the way they do.
Yep.
I think that's worth noting. All right. And that brings us to the end of this podcast. Introverts and extroverts show up a little different, but their working genius is the same. And it's really good to understand that so we can better work together and understand how to utilize one another's geniuses. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. We have a lot of new listeners. The numbers are just going up like crazy. We really appreciate your input and your following this and the passion that you have around working genius, and that you're helping other people figure out why they're on this earth and what they do best. So thanks for listening. We'll look forward to talking to you next time on the Working Genius Podcast. God bless.